Welcome to Bits and Pieces Quilting. Today we are going to talk about the pineapple trim tool, so stay tuned. Hi, I'm Michelle, and today I want to take you through some tips and tricks for using the pineapple trim tool. This is part of my series based on the rulers that I already have in my collection. If you haven't seen that video already, I encourage you to take a look. I posted it early in 2024, and it was called Quilting Rulers, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And I went through my entire collection to see what I already have, to see what I've used, what some of my favorites are, which ones I haven't used, and which ones I really haven't made the most of. And so this is part of that series, exploring the things that I already have in my collection. So let's dive right into the pineapple trim tool, and stay tuned to the end because I'll have some tips for you. I started this project by going through my 1.5-inch drawer of scraps and pulling out all of the blue, green, and gray 1.5-inch strips. So that's this collection here, all blues and greens and grays. And there's a few that, this one has some red in it, but it generally is blue. Teal, that's close enough to blue. Was sort of thinking ocean sea glass, that sort of thing. This one's more black than blue, but I think it all still fits. And I think this is a really nice collection of pieces, including some really little ones here. Then I also went through and pulled out all of the whites. So this one may not make it into the final, and it looks like one of the grays has migrated over here into the white section. But whites and slightly off whites, white with some green dots, white with some orange dots. And I had them in this bin, and I've had them in this bin for a little while, and I've been trying to think of what I wanted to do with them. And one of my thoughts was to try and make one of my half log cabins. And I have a full video and tutorial on how to make half log cabins if you want to check that out. Normally I use 2-inch strips for that, but I thought, well, maybe 1.5-inch strips. And then I thought, no, I love that pattern. I make that pattern a lot. Let's maybe look at something a little bit different. And so as part of my recent video on my collection of rulers, I pulled out the pineapple trim tool, and I thought, I wonder if the 1.5-inch pieces will work for the pineapple trim tool. The ruler itself says cut strips at least 1 3/4 inches wide. But I thought, I wonder, can I make it work? Can I make it work? Is 1.5 inches really too small? So I did a test block, and that's the test. This is the test block here. And it turned out just fine. I will show you a few tips and tricks as we go along. If you have the pineapple trim tool and you want to try it with 1.5-inch strips, there's a few little points where you have to just be extra careful, but it will work. What I did discover though, and obviously I think the ruler tells you that, and it's pretty clear, you need to start with a 2.5-inch strip in the middle, and then your end pieces also need to be bigger than 1.5 inches. So I've gone through my 2.5-inch drawer of scraps, and I've pulled out these ones. These are going to be the 2.5-inch strips for the middle, or squares for the middle. And then I've got a bunch of 2.5-inch strips here as well. No, not that one. In greens and blues and grays to go into the 4 corners. So let's dive into making these with the pineapple trim tool, and I'll show you the little tips and tricks to make the 1.5 inches work rather than the 1 3/4 that they recommend. One of the reasons why I wanted to see if I could make my 1.5-inch strips work for this project is because I don't save 1 3/4 inch strips. My scrap system is based on Bonnie Hunter's scrap management system, where I save strips that work together. So 1.5-inch strips, 2-inch strips, 2.5-inch strips, and I have been saving 3.5. But I'll tell you about that in a second. I'm not going to save those any longer because 1.5 and 1.5, when you sew those together with the seam allowance, you end up with 2.5 inches. So 1.5-inch strips play really well with 2.5-inch strips. 2 inches sewn to a 2-inch strip, that gives you a 3.5-inch strip. So that's a good reason to save 3.5 inches. And so these are all sizes that work together really well. And so those are the sizes I save. But as I alluded to, the 3.5 I've decided over the years just isn't really working for me. And so as I started this project, I realized I had a small stash of 3.5-inch strips left. And if I cut those in half, oh my gosh, quilting math, I ended up with 1 3/4-inch strips. So I do have one piece in here in this first round that is the 1 3/4 recommended by the template, but all of the others are just 1.5-inch strips. And so the point of this video isn't to show you how to use the tool. If you have the tool, you can watch other YouTube videos and the little booklet will tell you how to use it. But I just want to show you that the 1.5-inch strips do work really well. So with this little exception, I've taken my 2.5-inch center strip and I'll center the centering round the way that the instructions tell me on this square, and I'll trim up this first round. And so there is a little bit of waste here, but it is still going to be an amazing scrap busting project for me. And you can see how little of this you actually use. In the end, these pieces don't have to be that big, but I found the hard way that they do have to overlap in this first round because you need this little area as your 1/4-inch seam allowance for the next round. So they do have to overlap for this first round, but 1.5 inches is going to work perfectly fine. And so you can see where I have the 1 3/4 inches. This must have been 1 3/4 as well. I got a perfect square here. Where I have just the 1.5-inch pieces, I have these flattened squares, but this doesn't matter. And so let me show you the next round. I have a few little step outs here. So on this one, you can see I have 3 areas that were like this, like the 1.5-inch strips. And I've added 1.5-inch strips all the way around, except I took a 3.5-inch square and cut it in half diagonally, and this piece will also work for this round. One of the things that I will put on my website is a project sheet for this that will give you the minimum sizes that you need to cut for every round. I took notes as I was building these blocks so that I could save you some time and some fabric. And so I'll put that project sheet on my website. So this is round 2 and it's a blue round. So these pieces have to be a minimum of 1.5 by 3 inches, or in this case, a 3.5-inch square cut in 2. And so to trim this round, according to the instructions for the ruler, we line up the center square like this, and I'm able to trim 2 sides here. And so again, you can see the pieces that come off. It's not a lot of waste, especially if you cut the sizes the way that I've calculated them, so that you really minimize that waste. But with every round, you will end up cutting off a little bit like this. So this is the next round, all trimmed up. And again, you can see when the piece is bigger than you need, or the perfect size, you have these nice corners, but otherwise you get these squared off corners. And again, this isn't a problem. As we go to the next step out, these are all 1.5-inch pieces. Can you see these little gaps here? This is fine. This will all work out. This is all going to get trimmed up. And so this is the next round. This is the next round with white. These need to be 1.5 by 4 inches. And to trim these up, the ruler will tell you how to do that. You line this up here and you trim along this angle. And I'm going to zoom in a moment and I'll show you where things start to get a tiny bit, or could get a tiny bit hairy. You really want to make sure you use a scant 1/4-inch seam allowance. That's going to be one of the top tips for this. And as long as the piece that might be a tiny bit short. Can you see here how that's just a tiny bit short? Let me go and zoom the camera, and I'll show you on a couple of examples where things are a tiny bit short. But in my view, it doesn't make a difference in the final project as long as you have a good seam allowance and you have enough left. It's helping me use up the strips I already have, and I'm really in favor of that. So here we are with a little bit of a super zoom, and I don't know if that's easier to see where this falls just a tiny bit short. I have a couple of other examples here that I can show you. On this one, for example, this little white area, you can see this white was just a tiny bit short, but there's still enough caught in the seam allowance, and there's enough seams through all of this that this doesn't bother me. There's another example here where it's a little bit short, another example up here where it's a tiny bit short. And so if you look at all of the blocks that I've got, there's a few of those examples. Here's another example of where the white is just a tiny bit short, but there is still enough of a seam allowance that this is going to get captured in the seam allowance when I sew them together, and I'm not worried about this at all. I also found that if I wanted to use this piece, I'm actually using it flipped over. If you can see on the back, it's a little darker on this side, and I liked the lighter version on this side to blend into the lights for this project. So back to regular zoom, these little areas where the 1.5 inch strips are a tiny bit short, they don't bother me. So after a white, a blue, and a white round, we're going to go next to another blue round. And here again, I had some 4-inch squares that worked really well cut in half just to use up those scraps. 1.5 inch pieces here. And this piece is actually a piece of one of Jason's dress shirts that I have cut up with inspiration from Kathy Martin from Catbird Quilts. So excited to be able to include those pieces into this project. So this is now round 4. And to trim these up, line it up the way the instructions in the ruler tell you. And then trim off these edges. As you can see, there's no need to have these go overlap or any further along than they already are. And as round 4, the maximum, the length that you need for these pieces is 5 inches. And like I said, that project sheet will be on my website for you to download if you want those very specific measurements based on my experience. So I'm going to keep making these blocks and then get to the point to sew them together. While working on these ones, I've had a couple of different ideas, and I'm going to hold you in suspense for just a little minute while I figure out if I've got time to make a couple of samples. But if not, I will show you my quilt diagrams. It's all about color placement. What if, as Jenny Doan says, what if you do just this side in blue and leave these sides in white? Or what if you do blue down one diagonal and then just leave these as background? There's so much potential here, and I think we're going to get completely different looks depending on how it works out. Thanks very much for watching this video on the pineapple trim tool. I hope you picked up some tips along the way, but I'd like to sum up a few others that you may want to consider if you have this tool and if you plan to use it sometime soon. So number 1, use a scant 1/4 inch. You really don't need the extra seam allowance, particularly if you're going to use the cutting advice that I've provided on the project sheet on my website. These are the minimum sizes you can get away with to make this project. Number 2, make sure that your last pieces, rows 7 and 8, I think, of the final outside edges are the same size. I have some photos here that'll show you where I didn't take my own advice or where I learned this lesson, where the outside pieces were of a different width. And that created a little bit of a kerfuffle in the middle where those pieces come together. I'm fine with it. It's a scrappy quilt. It looks a little scrappy, but if you want your edges to be perfect, then you'll want to make sure that those last 2 rows are exactly the same size. Number 3, pick the same spot on the ruler every time. I like this ruler. I like the results, but I will say it's not nearly as accurate as you think that it should be for a tool like this. I found that I was fudging things here and there because I didn't pick the exact same spot, or I didn't remember what spot. And by that I mean, do you line things up so that the square is perfectly on the inside, perfectly on the outside? It was interesting to me how precise creative grids in a tool can often be, but how much variability there was in my final project. It all came together beautifully in the end. It's still easy to use, but it is something for you to consider. Tip number 4 is to press carefully. You may want to make sure that you've got nice, crisp pressing seams and that you don't leave anything a little wonky, a little wobbly, because that will grow and impact your final project. And finally, the last tip, tip number 5, these are bias edged final pieces. And so if you've ever worked with a bias edge before, you'll know that it's sort of a give and take. If you pull it too much or even just a little bit, you can pull it wildly out of shape. So you want to be careful when you're sewing these blocks together. But by the same token, bias edges can be incredibly forgiving. So in my instance, in my case, I found it went together really, really well. But I did see instances where I was trying to encourage things to line up and match, and the stretch because of that bias edge was really significant. So I hope you found these tips helpful. If you have this in your collection, I hope you will rediscover it, dig into your scraps, use up the smallest scraps that you have as a great way to bust into that stash. Thanks very much for watching, and don't forget to make the most of your fabric bits and pieces.